Ja, frid och shalom och välkommen till dagens uppdatering. Och här befinner jag mig mitt bland fåglarna här i Keilers park. Det viktigaste klippet idag, det följer ju nu. Alex Newman är på 1 minute to midnight och talar om saker och ting som håller på att ske, som har med profetia verkligen att göra. Visste ni till exempel att det finns förslag i Tyskland att man vill förbjuda biltrafik på helgerna? Om man lägger ut en liten tråd för att se vilket motstånd som man får, antagligen. Vi är på väg mot ett kontrollsamhälle, det kan ni vara så säkra på. Det Bibeln talar om. Men lammet, Jesus, han har redan övervunnit det här systemet. Och vi följer lammet vart det än går. Amen.
Då har vi ett intressant klipp att titta och lyssna på ifrån 1 minute to midnight. Det är Alex Newman, en väldigt kunnig person. Och det är svensk textas. Hur snabbt vi går emot det globala och den kristnes situation i det hela.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me, Tony.
And obviously, there's a ton of things we can talk about. Just very briefly off here, we mentioned some of them. So I'll let you start where you want to take us.
Well, just before coming on the program, I published an article about the president of Mexico, who happens to be, by the way, a socialist, a radical extremist member of every far left group you could think of at the international level, calling for a European Union-style government over North America. He says we need to create a North American community, and then pointed to the European Union as the example that we should follow. And so, you know, that obviously fits into the larger geopolitical effort to subvert national sovereignty, first through these regional governments, and then ultimately merging those all in, as Henry Kissinger explained in World Order, into the one world system that they're building. And a lot of researchers don't pay as much attention to the regionalization as I think they should, because that is actually the mechanism that's being used to undermine national sovereignty. Yes, they do intend to ultimately build the global system, but en route to that, the mechanism that they're using, and they say so, right? Klaus Schwab talks about it in his book on the Great Reset. The key mechanism they're using to kick out the sovereignty from underneath these countries is this regional process with the European Union as the model. And now, you know, North America was kind of the last nut to crack, I guess, if you will. But at this point now, with the president of Mexico openly saying this, they've been working on this for decades. It's now starting to come to fruition. And once they get North America, it's it's over. Every region in the world will have been regionalized, and then ultimately globalization will be the result.
Yeah, I remember there was the Club of Rome years ago put out a map with 10 regions. So yeah, I don't know how that much they're sticking to those exact, regions they had then, but you can see the push for this general idea has been in play for some time.
Yeah, and they've been openly talking about this for many decades now. Zbigniew Brzezinski promoted this idea pretty openly, along with Mikhail Gorbachev, who of course was a critical player in the Club of Rome. And I think they realized that moving directly into a one world system was going to be too much for people to swallow. In fact, I co-wrote a book many years ago called World Federalism 101, where back in the 1940s and the 1950s, you had a lot of very prominent people. I mean, people at the highest level of politics, et cetera, openly promoting the idea of a one world government. And what they found out was people were intimidated by the idea of a one world government. And so then they started promoting this idea of integration between the United States and the nations of Europe, that we would form this transatlantic alliance where we would all come under one free government, and little by little governments could join as they became freer, et cetera. And what they found out was that the Europeans then were scared of getting subsumed into this thing and becoming dominated by the United States. And so what they figured out, this was the deliberate policy of the U.S. government. The Marshall Plan provided a lot of the funding for this after World War II. The Central Intelligence Agency was deeply involved. They were even providing some of the funding for the fake grassroots groups to do this. They convinced the Europeans to first federate under a European Union. Started off as the Coal and Steel Community, then the European Free Trade Agreement. They turned it into the European Economic Community, then the European Community. Then they just came out and said it's going to be a European Union. You look at it today, it is, of course, more powerful in many ways than even the federal government in the United States, right? The federal government in the United States could never tell a state government, hey, we don't like your budget, go back to the drawing board and redraw your budget. And yet the European Union goes to national parliaments and says, hey, your budget is unacceptable. You need to redo this. Depending on whose numbers you look at, something like 90+% of the laws that govern the life of an average European are coming out of Brussels, ultimately. They're coming out of the European Union, the European Commission, which is not even an elected body. The European Parliament kind of rubber stamps it. So that is the model of governance that they want to move to. And they realized that this is less alarming to people. And Klaus Schwab talks about this in his book on the Great Reset. He says that during COVID, people got a little bit upset with globalization. And so he says we have this in-between solution. It'll be regionalization. And he points to how successful the European Union has been. He talks about North America, how the three economies on North America already trade more with each other than with others, and says this is the model that we will use going forward. So people be aware, your political leaders, your fake media talking heads may not come out and say, hey guys, welcome to the New World Order. You're all going to live under a one world government. If you live in Australia or New Zealand, they may say, hey, the Pacific Islands Forum, we just want closer cooperation and integration on free trade issues and things. But ultimately recognize this is all designed to subvert the sovereignty of your nation. It's designed to subvert self-government, and then ultimately merge us all into this one world superstructure, one world religious, economic, and political entity that they're working on building.
Well, what a wonderful solution to your border crisis. You won't need a border anymore.
Yeah. And what's so amazing, Tony, is that they have come out and publicly said that the clown car, formerly known as CNN, the Communist News Network or the Clinton News Network, after years and years of attacking us for saying that they were working on building a North American Union, they actually came out and they ran a piece on CNN.com saying we should just get rid of the borders between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. We should just have a single North American passport. And I guess that would eliminate the border crisis by eliminating the borders. But of course, the Mexicans don't want that. The Americans don't want that. Neither do the Canadians. And so as we know from documents released by WikiLeaks back about 12, 13 years ago now, the U.S. Embassy was plotting with government in Canada and almost certainly in Mexico as well on how to sell this to the people without them figuring out exactly what was going on. And even more troubling, how to get around constitutions. How do we get around the U.S. Constitution? How do we get around the Canadian Constitution to be able to merge these countries together? They were talking openly about a single currency for North America called the Amero. They've been talking about creating a North American Parliament. So all this stuff is happening, and they used to ridicule people for pointing it out. Now it's like, oh, well, you don't like that? Well, you must be some kind of extremist. What are you, racist against Canadians or Mexicans? Right? And I grew up in Mexico. I spent more time living in Mexico than any other country in the world, and I like Mexico, but they like Mexico the way it is, and we like the United States the way it is, and the Mexicans don't want to merge with the United States any more than Americans want to merge with Mexico, but this is what the elites have determined, or the elitists have determined needs to happen, so we need to fight them tooth and nail, and we need to expose this shadowy secret agenda that they have. So
you've got that agenda with the American Union and the various regional unions. Well, what about at the same time we've got the push with the pandemic treaty coming up on, I think the 27th, is it, that it gets voted on, which is basically another step towards removing the powers of individual nations and supplanting them with a global authority. So what's your thoughts on where we're heading with that at the moment?
Well, there are several things to be very concerned about when it comes to this World Health Organization power grab. And we can spend all day on this. First of all, it's run by a guy who literally was a leader in a mass murdering communist terrorist organization, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, who was put there by a mass murdering communist terrorist organization called the Chinese Communist Party. Literally, right through bribery and other means, that's how they got this guy in charge. And of course, Bill Gates has been putting a lot of the funding and the muscle behind this. But this, there's two different projects that they're working on that are both intimately related. There's the International Pandemic Accord, they're calling it now, because they know a Senate requires ratification by or a treaty requires ratification by the U.S. Senate. And then they're pushing the amendments to the international health regulations. Now, they've walked back some of the more blatant power grabs. Massive opposition here in the United States. Every one of the 49 Republican senators, we have 100 U.S. senators, every one of the 49 Republican senators sent a letter to Joe Biden saying, look, you can't do this. You need to stop doing this. If you do this, we're going to consider it a treaty and we're going to have to vote on it. And so right there, they realize they've got a big problem when it comes to the United States. We have 22 states now. The state attorney general, who's kind of like the chief legal officer of these states, have sent a letter to Joe Biden saying, look, the U.S. Constitution doesn't even give these powers to the U.S. government. Certainly, the U.S. government cannot give powers away that it doesn't even have to begin with. And even if it did have these powers, if you want to give them away, you have to ratify this properly as a treaty. So now you've got big opposition in Britain. The British government is at least pretending to be opposed to this. You've got a number of senators in Australia pushing back on this. You've got the recently shot in New Zealand as well. Yeah. You've got the recently shot Prime Minister of Slovakia pushing back on this. So a lot of opposition to this. And so they've walked back some of the more obvious power grabs. That's what they're doing right now. But I want to warn people, not a lot of people have picked up on this yet, but in this agreement, they're actually setting up a conference of the parties mechanism, just like they do with the climate scam. So they have the initial bedrock treaty that they use as then the foundation to build more on. And that's what's happening with this WHO power grab. They expect that they'll come back every year, they'll do a conference of the parties, all the governments will get together and they'll say, hey, we should add this new power to the World Health Organization. All in favor say aye, and people will go back to sleep, they won't be paying attention. And so every year that passes, they'll grab more and more power. But there's another hidden thing in here that not a lot of people have talked about either. James Roguski is one of the few, to his credit, who's drawn attention to this, and that is the genetic engineering component. They want to create these WHO biolabs around the world. They want to catalog the genetic information of every living organism on the planet. They're trying to bribe third world governments to come on board by promising them licensing fees if biopharmaceutical companies or whatever in the Western world use genetic material obtained from their country for some new product or new scheme that they're working on. But this is incredibly dangerous. They shouldn't be doing it in the first place. And the World Health Organization needs to be disbanded. This is just an organization from the pit of hell. Everything that I have seen them work on, whether it be vaccination campaigns or international pandemic measures or everything that they're working on is just ridiculous, and it ought to be shut down.
Well, you've got to also remember the fact, for people that don't know, Bill Gates is a huge funder of this. In fact, he puts more money into this than most countries. He's so in a sense, we know his stance on where he's heading with everything, and he's almost become the not de facto dictator or behind the scenes of the WHO, but certainly, and of course, I don't believe Bill Gates is at the top either. He's probably the lackey for someone else, but he is the face of power behind a lot of this, and we already know what his beliefs are on so many things. So why people can't realise that politicians, or maybe they do, I don't know. But it's a pretty bad thing when we realise that Bill Gates is going to be the guy calling the shots behind the scene, with people calling the shots behind him, of course. But
right. And, to pick up on that, one of the big things that Bill Gates has made clear now over many, many years is that he thinks there are too many of us on the planet. And frankly, the idea of putting my healthcare in the hands of somebody who thinks there are too many of us on this planet, it's hard to think of something more ridiculous, right? And yet that's what they're publicly saying. You've got the CCP and Bill Gates, both of whom are radically opposed to the population. The CCP has actually been caught doing unbelievably horrible things to enforce its population control measures, including forced abortions, forced sterilizations. These are not the kind of people that you want doing anything, much less overseeing your health care, telling your government what it must do. This is pure crazy talk. And I don't think you have to be on the left or the right of the political spectrum. You don't have to be a Christian to realize that this is absurd, this is dangerous, this comes out of the pit of hell, and it needs to be stopped.
It's funny, just off the track a bit, but as you were talking that, I suddenly thought about King Charles and his portrait. He's another man that's calling shots behind the scenes on the climate agenda. And for people that have seen it, I mean, this terrible red portrait of King Charles that looks satanic in itself, then when you mirror it, you see a Baphomet image quite plainly. When you put four of them on top of each other, you can see the whole, basically a whole Baphomet. There's no way that was an accident. It's just too obviously there. So there's the Luciferian power behind these people right there, in a sense, in plain sight.
Yeah, and that's what the Bible teaches. For me, I'm always amazed when Christians express surprise that we have actual evildoers running critical institutions. Like the Bible refers to Satan as the god of this world, the prince of the power of the air. 1 John chapter 5 says the whole world lies in the power of the evil one. If Christians would just read their Bibles, they would understand much more about the reality that we find ourselves in than everyday people, and yet they don't. They're surprised. You mean there are people in power who are evil? Yes, that's what we mean, and that's exactly what the Bible teaches.
Yep. So what about then we had, well, won't go into that too much, but I think the Eurovision Song Contest or whatever, and the Irish entry was blatantly non-binary, Luciferian. I couldn't even watch it. It was just so bad. And yet they won 6th place or something. And it's like when you realize that people think this is acceptable and good, this is how far our society has fallen globally. That's just like unbelievable. A few years ago, no way that would have been acceptable. And then moves me on to thinking about the statement by the NATO chief just coming out about the support of our NATO's there to support the LGBTQ movement.
Yeah, truly amazing. And you think back to how many people have lost their lives in these conflicts serving under NATO command. If they had known that they were fighting a war, they were risking their life to protect sodomy and gender confusion, they would have ripped their uniform off and run. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. The then head of MI6 said something similar when the war in Ukraine started. We got to fight this battle for LGBT rights. Like, are you kidding me? I mean, the Ukrainian boys that are fighting and dying right now against Russian troops. Does anybody seriously think they're fighting and dying so that people can sodomize each other and so that children can be castrated? I mean, it's so utterly ridiculous, but it shows you really where Western leaders are at. The unfortunate reality, Tony, is that this has been the case for a long time. They just weren't quite as bold to come out and say it because they knew they would have been run out of office quite properly. So we have had degenerates like this at the highest levels of power for a very, very long time. You look at Hollywood, you look in the music industry, you look in government, you look in the business world. You have people who think this way, and you have had for a very long time. It's only now that they're getting bold enough to just openly say it. And we should all be paying attention to this. If this doesn't show you that what the Bible teaches is real, I don't know what will.
Yeah, that's very true. With it, the whole climate change agenda and all of that that's going on, pushing stuff, really we're being cornered in all directions, in a sense.
Yep, and that's the goal, right? What we are going to see here, if there is a pause on this, is increasingly blatant discrimination and ultimately hatred and targeting of Christians, right? We're watching that happen already. And this LGBT hysteria, it needs to be understood in that context. It's not even necessarily because the people running these institutions like NATO are all into sodomy. The real ultimate objective is to put a big fat bullseye on the backs of Christians. And we're seeing that bullseye. I mean, it's like every day now we're seeing pastors targeted, pastors shot. We saw that bishop in Australia stabbed by a lunatic while he was preaching. And just last week we had a guy run up to a pastor while he was preaching a sermon in Pennsylvania and try to shoot him. Thankfully, the gun jammed. 2 weeks ago, A pastor that I just met, that I just taught at the Liberty Pastor Summit, was actually murdered in Miami. It's happening more and more frequently. And when you look at the ultimate objective of all this LGBT stuff, it is really, I think the end goal is actually to criminalize the gospel, to persecute anyone who speaks biblical truth. And it's not even just on this issue, right? It's not like you just can't say something wrong about homosexuality or gender confusion. It's not that you just can't stand up for what God teaches about marriage, what God teaches about gender, things like this. Ultimately, the big prize is the gospel itself. And we see this so clearly with this effort to stop what they call conversion therapy. When taken to its logical conclusion, what they are saying is you cannot tell somebody that God can give them a new heart of flesh and replace their heart of stone. You cannot tell somebody that when you surrender your life to Jesus Christ, he can completely transform you. You are born again. You are a new creation with new desires. And as Paul says, right, such were some of you. There's liars and homosexuals and all these different things. Their goal is to make it a crime for you to say that. And that has been the case throughout a lot of human history. If you told people the truth, if you told people the gospel, you could be martyred, you could be imprisoned, you could be tortured for a while. That stopped in the Western world, but it looks like we're very rapidly now moving back in that direction, and God help us.
You know, I also think that there are plants put out there to make Christians look bad. Holly, my wife, is telling me about somebody she saw preaching out, in the middle of town in Pennsylvania the other day, and the city where she is, and I'll be there in a few days' time. But the person was preaching a very loveless gospel, just if you don't all repent, you're all going to hell, kind of hellfire and brimstone with no context. And even Holly couldn't listen to it, And this is angering people that are hearing it right in the middle of downtown. So it makes Christians look bad because Jesus preached the gospel. Well, sure, he spoke the truth, but he did it in love. And we're supposed to exhibit love, but a lot of these people are not exhibiting love. And I start to question whether some of them are deliberately sent out there to make Christians look bad, so that people can clamp down later on and say, this is hate speech, we've got to get rid of these people, and do exactly what you're just saying. I think this has been going on for a while, that there are people that are deliberate deceivers out there doing this, probably being paid a big backhand for it.
Yeah. There's, the Westboro Baptist Church, and I don't know these people, but they love to go out. They love to use this really inflammatory language that and inflammatory rhetoric that true Christians with love in their heart for their fellow human beings would probably not use. And, it's a really important thing to talk about. I have interviewed many former homosexuals, people who were suffering from same-sex attraction, and everyone that I ever asked, how did you get set free from that? And of course, Jesus Christ is the answer, but the gospel came through somebody who was loving, somebody who cared about them, somebody who at every step of the way was careful to distinguish between the sin and the individual caught up in the sin. That is the preaching of the gospel that God uses to change hearts, to change minds, and to bring people to himself. The kind of hateful preaching that we see really widely in the media, right? The media loves this kind of stuff. They love to put that on the front page of the newspaper. They love to put that on TV. Say, oh, look at those mean Christians. They hate you because of who you are. And of course, that's a lie from the pit of hell. But I suspect that there's almost certainly some of that going on, Tony. And, I'm not normally judgmental about how people go about evangelism, but I think we have to be clear here that Jesus Christ told us to speak the truth in love. In fact, just this weekend at church, pastor was preaching out of 2 Timothy. And we are to guard the treasure that God has given us in his word, and we are to do that in love with the help from the Holy Spirit. And that is an absolute essential component of sharing the truth with people.
So as Christians then, we're faced with this world that's going down the gurgler faster and faster in the West. we've got to negotiate our way through this with wisdom, which can at times not be so easy, because we can't escape from the fact that there are so many people with weird ideologies and things and, lifestyles that we don't agree with, but we are having to face them more and more in the real world. Not so much in the little town area and rural area where I am at the moment, but you go into the, larger cities and things and it's everywhere. So as Christians, we can't escape it. We have to be able to deal with it.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I was just reading the Gospel of Matthew with my children, and you look at who Jesus reserved the most fire and brimstone for. It was the religious leaders, the legalists and things. He was generally very compassionate with sinners. He was generally very loving with sinners. And the ones that he really came down hard on were the religious leaders. And so, it's always worth remembering that as Christians, we don't want to be the Pharisees.
No, that's true. We don't. And talking about religious leaders, there's another one that's been very outspoken again lately, as has often been the case, and that's Pope Francis, who is not the example we want to follow.
Right. Yeah, Pope Francis is just out of control. This is a guy who every day he gives us new evidence of the fact that he is not teaching true religion. He's not teaching what the Bible teaches. And in fact, I've interviewed Catholic priests. I interviewed a great Catholic priest maybe 6 months ago, a year ago maybe now, and he told me on camera that Pope Francis is teaching doctrines of demons. So if Catholics can see that Pope Francis is teaching doctrines of demons, Catholic priests can see that he's teaching doctrines of demons, it should be pretty clear for self-proclaimed Bible-believing evangelical Christians that something is fishy here. And yet you have all these evangelical leaders and Orthodox leaders, not to mention, the pagans and the heathens and the others, rallying behind him because he cares about the climate or, whatever the case may be. Yeah. Everything that we need to know about what he's teaching should be very clear at this point, just with what he's done over the last decade or so. And it's getting worse every day.
Yeah, and with the Catholic doctrine of the infallibility of the Pope, it's like how many Catholics, you mentioned that some of them don't support him, but there are a lot that still blindly do simply because he is the Pope and they've been told, I grew up in the Catholic Church when I was younger and we were told basically the Pope was infallible. Anything the Pope said, was basically God's representative on earth and you had to follow it. Well, it should be becoming really obvious to Catholics that this is not the truth. Pope Francis is not an infallible man by any, stretch of the imagination in terms of his doctrine. And, what are you, if you're a Catholic listening, how are you going to respond to this?
Yeah, and I know a lot of Catholics who've looked at this and said, well, he better not make any pronouncements on faith and morals, or then I'm in big trouble. Then I might have to leave the church.
He's doing it all the time, and encyclicals and so on,
Yep, it's so true. And there is, of course, a broad movement of Catholics who claim the Pope is illegitimate. Yeah. They claim that the chair of Peter is empty, especially traditional Catholics, and they actually got singled out by the FBI for surveillance. Of course, can't have any Catholics who reject this Bergoglio running around spreading dissension among the ranks. So, this is so suspicious. And I've seen it very clearly following the climate shenanigans for so long now. That should be all you need to know to recognize that this is not coming from God. I mean, this is clearly not coming from God. He's trying to redefine sin. At the last climate conference I went to on the Arabian Peninsula, they had the Faith Pavilion, as they put it, right at the heart of the summit. It was literally right in the middle of the area where this giant summit was. And the Pope was supposed to come and read a little, speech about how important faith was to this climate process. He got sick, so he couldn't come. But he sent the Secretary of State for the Vatican to come give his speech for him. And the first thing that really jumped out at me is he's actually claiming that our alleged environmental offenses, if you will, are, in his words, an offense against God. So he's trying to redefine sin here so that your sin is not necessarily your lying, your hate, your nasty thoughts, whatever it is. It's your carbon footprint. I mean, really, alarm bells should be going off pretty loud and clear here, folks.
Yes, yep. Absolutely. So before we wrap up, have you got any other things that you think are important to bring out here today?
Well, working on a big story right now about various state efforts to turn gold into a transactional currency. So I'm hoping to have that done by the end of the week. With this really rapid move towards central bank digital currencies, a lot of state governments here are getting concerned and saying, well, what are our people going to do if this whole thing comes crashing down? And so glad to see people at all levels of government looking at what's happening objectively and saying, hey, this is not good. And I hope that'll cause more people to look at the big picture too, right? It's not just about CBDCs. It's not just about the climate scam. It's not just about the subversion of our sovereignty or the destruction of our borders. Ultimately, we need to be looking at this through a biblical lens, and that is, this is a spiritual war going on. And all of this should be pointing us back to Christ. And so I hope that Christians will take all this chaos in the world and use it as a springboard then to introduce people to the gospel, to the saving power of Jesus Christ. And ultimately, that ought to be our goal, making disciples of all nations. And there's never been a greater opportunity to get the word out to a lost and dying world.
That's very true. Obviously, that is the first and foremost, most important thing. It is interesting that you just mentioned the gold thing, though. I've been watching it very closely as a person that's believed for a long time that the price of gold is going to go into the stratosphere at some point, and silver with it. And I'm watching silver starting to really move up now, which I think at some point silver is going to close a gap to gold very, very much, and will end up in the hundreds of dollars an ounce at least. So I'm looking at somebody that's believed in that gold and silver are really the only physical money that God actually himself created, not these fiat currencies and all of that. And so I'm looking at that and thinking, well, this is actually good in a sense that they're becoming more valuable to where they should be. But the bad side of that is, why is it happening now? The fact that the prices of gold and silver are going up so much is telling you these underlying issues, and the elites and the central banks are grabbing it all up, the physical stuff, because the paper markets will collapse. But, we need to be prepared. I believe in physical preparation, and gold and silver is something that people should consider anyway.
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I always tell people, first of all, you want to make sure you're storing your treasure in heaven, not on earth.
Yeah.
But second of all, you have an obligation to take care of the people in your own household. The Bible actually in Proverbs says that the righteous man saves up an inheritance for his children's children. If you don't take care of those of your own household, you're worse than an infidel. And of course, the book of Proverbs tells us that the wise man sees trouble coming and prepares himself. Yeah. Folks, trouble is coming. Now would be a good time to prepare yourself, especially if you have a spouse and children and others who will be dependent on you during potentially very tough times coming upon us very soon. So,
yeah, very true. Well, we've covered a lot of different things today, Alex, but it's been very interesting, and it's always good to have you on the show.
I appreciate it very much.
Det är ju tydligt att det här har bibliska proportioner. Krig, rykten om krig. Kinesiska militärer kring Taiwan för att testa deras stridsförmåga. Kina har inlett en flera dagar lång militärövning kring Taiwan som ett svar på installationen av öns nya president i måndags. Peking ser Taiwan som en del av Kina och har inte uteslutit att ta ön med våld. Kinesisk tv rapporterar att övningen ska ses som en varning. Ja, vad tycker ni då, internationella brottsdomstolen, om att ett land hotar ett annat fritt land i Förenta Nationerna? Det börjar likna hyckleri allt det här av yppersta klass, eller vad tycker ni? Då ser vi på bilden här Rikshospitalet i Oslo i Norge. Det största sjukhuset i hela landet. Skulle du som jude känna dig trygg att komma in och bli behandlad här? Ha kippa och Davids stjärna på dig. Det som händer nu i världen och i vårt vårt närområde också. Det tyder ju på att det här är andligt. Att stå för Israel kommer att kosta. Och det kostar redan. Då undrar ju ni kanske varför vi inte har kommentarer på våran sida. Jo, därför att vi har fått smakat på lite ord om hur mycket man hatar dessa judar. Och de kan ju bara säga förlåt att vi finns till, ungefär.
Det var kallt, det var mörkt, och på gården brann en eld, där som kalla kunde värma sig invid. Där vid elden satt en man, rädd och kluven i sitt sinn. Med hans inre stod en strid. Han beskylldes för att vara det hans hjärta honom sa, men hans läppar hördes vara nekande. När han lyfte ögonen, titta bort mot mästaren, vällde bittra tårar fram. Alla drömmarna försvann, illusionerna dök fram, och ur askan dök det hemska spöket fram. Bävande hans hjärta såg att han ej mer kunde gå på den väg han älskat så. Det finns mer än en idag som är lika trött och svag, som vi läser om att Petrus en gång var. Ingen kan så helt undgå att i livet smaka på den tribut som synden tar. Men i Bibeln får vi svar på vårt hjärtas bittra kvar, ty där står om en som seger vunnit har. Det var han som en gång dog, men som upp ur graven stod, och som hälsar till sitt barn. Hälsa den, särskilt den som misslyckats gång på gång, men som ändå i sitt hjärta älskar mig. Jag är med dig alla dagar, reser dig ur nederlag, gör dig stark fast du är svag. Petrus blev den han blev, vi kan läsa i hans brev hur hans nya styrka ut i Herren var. Det är likadant för dig, glöm ej att han älskar dig, så en hälsning till dig har. Res dig upp, må var stark, med en Gud som gett dig allt, som i sonen skänkt oss himlens härlighet. Det var blodet på ett kors som blev räddningen för oss, denna seger för evighet. Hälsa dem, särskilt dem som misslyckats gång på gång, men som ändå i sitt hjärta älskar mig. Jag är med dig alla dagar, reser dig ur nederlag, gör dig stark fast du är svag. särskilt den som misslyckas gång på gång, men som ändå i sitt hjärta älskar mig. Jag är med